Welcome back to the channel. This is Jake Ramgren here with you today. If you don't know who I am, I'm a writer for the New Creation blog. I have a degree in zoology, and I travel the country and present and talk on issues related to creation and evolution, do some scientific research in the field of zoology, and just overall I'm overall trying to bring the creation movement here to the region of New England. So I've actually had a busy week doing just that this week. On Monday, I got to drive out to Boston. I'm always looking for a good excuse to go out to Boston, and met with a colleague and creationist there. There will be some YouTube content coming out about that. And then on Tuesday, I went out to New Haven, Connecticut to visit the Yale Peabody Museum, and I gave 2 museum tours. Each one was about an hour and a half long, to some homeschool groups, just walked through the museum and told everything from more of a creationist perspective and reinterpreted everything they were seeing, so that they could understand the creation model as well as the evolutionary model that the museum teaches. And then finally, 2 days ago now, I got to go out to Community Christian School, which is in Granville, Mass. And I spoke at chapel there for the middle and high school, as well as for the elementary school, and then gave a couple of talks at the 6th and 7th grade classes. So it's been quite a week. My voice was a little hoarse yesterday, so I wasn't able to kind of film this video, but I've wanted to get this out pretty soon after. It's been a little bit since I posted, and I teased this yesterday on the YouTube channel, posted that the next thing I'd talk about are the big 3 organizations in creationism. So it's kind of a regular thing now that I've seen. Everybody kind of understands that there are 3 big creation organizations that have that name recognition that people know about, that people know names from. And this has become quite a thing in creationism, where there's these centralized big organizations that have lots of funding, they have lots of donors, and they are really, these great apologetics ministries. And then there's been other kind of creation outlets that have been getting built and coming out around these organizations. So, and there's pros and cons to, the organizations, and there's pros and cons to trying to start something new, like what we're doing here with Creation Reformation, that is not the same as what the big organizations are doing. I'm going to help you navigate through all of it. So even just this week, whether it's being at a K through 12 Christian school, or whether it's giving people a museum tour, I'll hear questions about the big 3 organizations. People ask me what resources I would recommend. People ask me what I think about Ken Ham and the Ark Encounter. And this is just sometimes it's the first thing I get. So I do visit quite a few churches, and I can even think of examples off the top of my head where I talk to the pastor, and like as soon as I mention that I'm a creation scientist and that I do things like this, one of the first questions I get is like, "Oh, what do you think of Ken Ham down at the research at the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter?" And so it's kind of the first thing that comes up, because again, these organizations have that name recognition. So that's what we're going to navigate today. Now that my voice is a little bit better, we are talking about Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and the Institute for Creation Research. Am I going to just praise these organizations and say that they're perfect? Absolutely not. Am I going to give you what I think are the pros and the cons of these big organizations? That's exactly what I'm going to do. So thank you for joining me on the Creation Reformation YouTube channel, and let's get into it. All right. So as I said, there are 3 significant creation organizations that have name recognition. They have funding from donors. They have that influence in the creation movement. Most creationists are very familiar with these 3 organizations. Probably all creationists are. It's probably not that exaggerated to say that if you are a creationist, you have probably read something, heard something, or seen something from one of these organizations. So we're going to jump through each of them in turn and even take a look at their websites and things like that. So I'm going to help you navigate through this. So, what are some of the pros, though? We'll start with the positives. What are the pros of visiting the big three creation organizations, going to their museums, joining their website, getting their newsletters, kind of relying on them as a resource or as a source for your creation knowledge? So some of the pros are pretty obvious. One, these organizations get lots of funding, so their reach is going to be bigger than some of these smaller creation websites that you can run across. So oftentimes they are better looking than other creation websites. I try my best with the Creation Reformation website. I think it looks pretty decent, but that's just me, right? That's just me putting it together and coordinating with like two other people who are involved with it. And so it's not professionally done, right? But if I had lots of funding, I could hire somebody to come in and do that. And so so with lots of funding, you can do a lot of things. So Answers in Genesis, in particular, the website looks very great visually. They have a great brand. You can navigate to any parts of their website pretty easily. Everything is right there, and it looks pretty good. So they're easy to navigate, and they tend to be better equipped in that practical aspect. So it's good to visit their websites because it's like I said, you can find resources quickly. You can find what you're looking for because the website is so easy to navigate, and they have a consistent brand, and they look good. And that's kind of one of the positives. And because of this, partly because of this, they have a wide audience. So Answers in Genesis famously came here from Australia. Ken Ham moved from Australia over to the States and brought this organization with him. And that's because of that. They have an international audience. They can do things like build the Ark encounter and build a creation museum. And so the audience that they're going to reach, the churches that they reach, are going to be more wide spread. And so that's true of all three creation organizations. More people recognize the name Institute for Creation Research than they do, obviously, all the small creationist YouTube channels or resources that are out there, including like the New Creation blog as a good example of a lesser known project that is not related to the big three creation organizations. Another thing is that they're easy to understand. Oftentimes, these organizations are focused on educating the public on the issues and explaining topics to the layperson, the churchgoer, however you want to say it nicely. We're not saying that they're dumb. In fact, quite the opposite. We're saying that the general audience, they do not have a background in science or in apologetics. So just they want to know what's going on in the realm of apologetics and in the realm of science. And so these organizations take these things and they explain it with the intent of making it clear for the kind of regular everyday Christian, which is extraordinarily helpful. As an early on as a creationist, if I wanted to know about the issues and I needed something explained clearly, I could hop on to Answers in Genesis or Answers Research Journal or Institute for Creation Research, and I would type in, articles. I would find articles on some things that maybe I didn't quite understand as well as I wanted to. So it's a great advantage for kind of learning the basics of creationism. Another great advantage is that they have resources for kids. And the next bullet point I have there fits in with this, right? They have magazines that kids can read and adults can read. They have lots of videos. Answers in Genesis even has Answers TV, right? They have a whole TV news channel that is kind of built for all ages that can kind of walk you through science from a creation perspective. They have VBS curriculum, things like that. So big organizations means you have big resources, and that means you have ways of reaching children and reaching churches, and you just have access to all those things. And then lastly, add on there, kind of already talked about this, but they have the resources to build museums and build the Ark encounter and things like that, which I've been to the Ark. It's pretty amazing just being there, seeing the size of what the Ark was. Really, really cool that Answers in Genesis built the Ark encounter. It was really cool to see that. I don't think it's perfect. There were some exhibits that I didn't particularly, I wouldn't write home about on the inside, but just being there, standing there in front of Noah's Ark was an awesome experience. And I have to give Answers in Genesis a ton of credit for putting that together and not caring about, kind of the hate that they're going to get from from everyone else. So major credit to them for building that. And again, one of the biggest benefits of a creation organization that's got a lot of funding is you can do things like this. Now, so I just want to start with the pros so I can throw out there. I have nothing against the people behind Answers in Genesis or ICR or CMI or any of these organizations. I'm just giving an honest approach to looking at these organizations, and I just want people to be aware of what they are. And so the next thing, yes, I'm going to get into some cons. And so with these big organizations, there are going to be some things that you can identify as being not the best about these organizations. And so let's just kind of dive into some of those. I will say definitely this is not necessarily a con in and of itself. Okay, the first one I'm talking about, it is not a negative in and of itself. But it is something to note in that these organizations are apologetics focused very often. Now, some more than others. I would say out of the three, Answers in Genesis is the most apologetics focused. But all three have an apologetics angle to them. And again, it's okay to have an organization for apologetics. That is perfectly fine. But that you just have to be aware that they are going to be, their mindset and their vision is going to be defending or demonstrating the truth of the scripture, which is perfectly fine. That's great. We need apologetics organizations, in my opinion. The only but there is that if you're going to be focused on apologetics, you have to then keep that in mind when you start talking about the scientific issues. So just know that these organizations are not, strictly speaking, science organizations. They're not the Christian National Geographic or the Christian Discovery or the Christian, any one of these, the Christian Science.com. Like they're not any of these things because they're not exclusively a science organization. They're also apologetics oriented. And so because they have this apologetics focus, which is not a problem, it's just something you need to be aware of if you're looking for scientific answers. Just know that you might not get them here because these organizations are going to be they're answering questions that are more religious or spiritual than they're answering questions that are scientific. That doesn't mean they don't answer scientific questions at times. You just got to keep in mind what these organizations are. They're not strictly speaking science. Their goal is to demonstrate the reliability of the Bible, which I applaud them for. So I put that in the cons, but it's not in and of itself a con. But with being apologetics focused does come some things that are somewhat cons. For example, the second point is they fall into kind of an us versus them mentality. And this is something that I think my channel at Creation Reformation is going to talk a lot about. They have this mindset that all of academia is against them and they are kind of going against the grain. And in a lot of senses, that is true. Conventional scientists, almost all scientists, don't agree with the creation organization. So I can understand why this has kind of developed this way. But with an us versus them mentality comes a focus from these organizations on proving the other side wrong and proving them right. And that's not exactly the way you want to build an organization around. It's not necessarily beneficial to develop your entire identity over proving mainstream ideas to be completely wrong or bunk. And then further, as a result of this, we come to the first real big con. So the first two, not necessarily negatives in and of themselves. Yes, apologetics is great. Yes, creationists and evolutionists are on different sides of this. And so you can have an us versus them mentality. Those things aren't horrible. But as a result of those things, we get some little problems that arise, such as misunderstanding evolution. So sometimes if you have this us versus them mentality, you're trying to simplify things and preach to the churchgoer and demonstrate the truth of creation and the truth of the Bible. Sometimes what happens is you misrepresent the other side. And I think it's fair to say that sometimes the big three organizations have fallen into the trap of misunderstanding or misrepresenting the theory of evolution. And I'll get into some examples of that later on. But I think if you're a scientist, if you know what evolution is, and then you look and see how these organizations just depict it or talk about it, you can recognize ways that they misrepresent what the theory is saying. And then this is really the biggest con here, is that if you have big organizations, that what comes with that is competition. So sometimes these creation organizations compete with one another. Sometimes they compete with other creation sites that are smaller and outside of the big three, and they want to make sure that they are right. They're businesses, right? They want to make sure that they're getting revenue. And what they can fall into the trap of is sometimes if they disagree with other organizations, they disagree with other creationists, it tends to fall into this idea of being competitive, right? They want people coming to them, right? Answers in Genesis wants people coming to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. And the ICR has their own little Creation Museum down in Texas. And so you can see that there might be some competition among them, especially when there are topics with which creationists disagree on. You can also find that creation organizations are too skeptical of academia. At times, they act like scientists in the mainstream fields are they disregard everything that they say because they're sinful people who are they are putting their assumptions before the science, and they are completely led astray. They don't want to believe in a God, and so they invent things like evolution, and they only believe in evolution because they don't want to need to believe in a God, so they change their lifestyle. They make these assumptions about academic scientists, and then kind of disregard everything those academic scientists say. And so I'll talk a lot more about this as my channel progresses, about maybe better approaches to coming to the table with scientists of other backgrounds. But I think it's safe to say that sometimes these creation organizations can be overly skeptical of academic research. They disregard everything that academic research says because of things like evolutionary assumptions, and these scientists are ignoring the evidence because they really want to believe evolution is true, when in fact these are really just scientists who are doing research, and they accept evolution because they see a lot of evidence for it, and they're operating off of that basis because evolution as a theory works pretty well. And so I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to be overly skeptical of scientists who are evolutionists. I think we need to kind of come to the table more and see where they're coming from. And again, this can kind of devolve into something resembling our current political climate really quickly. They have a focus on outreach, which is not necessarily a con in and of itself. They need revenue, they need donors, they need people coming to their museums and reading their blogs. And so their focus is on getting people in. And that can lead to a very pragmatic approach where they will say things that will get them views, rather than saying things that are true. And I think everyone can fall into that trap. I'll probably fall into that trap trying to build a platform here. But it's worth noting, and this goes with any organization, any news source, that if you are a platform and you're trying to get people to listen to you, sometimes you will say things that will get you views, and that becomes your priority over saying things that are useful to say. Another thing, though, is these organizations can be hostile to alternative opinions. They will attack sides that don't agree with them. This includes creationists as well as evolutionists. Kind of anywhere you're from, if you disagree with them, sometimes they can turn kind of into bully ball because they're a big organization and they will call out another group. And they've actually, so creation, if you go into the history of this, creation organizations, and I don't want to group them all together because each one does this differently, but they've had a history of doing this. And to their credit, sometimes they have course corrected and said, we apologize. We did not mean to attack or name call. We shouldn't have done that. And so you've seen that in places before. So I don't want to kind of group them all together and say that they're all hostile to alternative opinions. They can be sometimes, but it's kind of a case-by-case basis. But I'm putting all these cons here together so that you're aware as you navigate these organizations that there's some things to keep your eye on, or keep an eye out for. They have centralized leadership can be a big problem, right? One person kind of is behind the whole organization, and so the whole organization basically answers to one or a small few people. So leadership can be very centralized, and then you basically have it being one person's organization instead of a creation organization. Finally, this is another con, is that the scientific journals, and this is where I just have to come out and say it, the scientific journals put out by these organizations are not exactly at the same academic level as mainstream scientific journals. Peer review is not at the same level. And you can tell this just by reading the articles that are being published by the scientific journals. They're just not quite there. They're not there yet. They need some work before they can reach that academic level. Now, credit to them for having the scientific journals, but they're just not at the peer-reviewed academic level that I'm hoping they will be. Now, there's a new one, of course, there's a new academic journal out from the New Creation blog, where I write. And so we have a journal out called New Creation Studies, and we're trying to actually rethink how peer review is done. We have a new method of peer review. And so hopefully that helps, right? Hopefully that can kind of be an example to, if it works, hopefully it can set an example to creation organizations that we can put together academically sound scientific journals that are kind of up to snuff with normal mainstream scientific journals. So just want to note that when you go on to something like Answers Research Journal, if you read it and it sounds kind of, again, more apologetics focused, or it sounds like it's more of a debate than it is a scientific paper, that can happen. And that's because the peer review is just not at that level yet. So keep that in mind if you visit their scientific journals. So with that, that's kind of 20 minutes there of going through the pros and cons of creation organizations. I don't mean to attack anyone or offend anyone or go after organizations. I just think it's an honest approach to the benefits and also the detriments of having a big organization that has lots of funding and lots of resources that's all centralized and is from one place. So there's always going to be pros and cons to that, and it's something we need to keep in mind as we use these organizations. So let's take a look at these one by one. So first, I want to start with Creation Ministries International. I just kind of have a few kind of categories or tabs to go over, and I'll go over these quickly, and then we'll hop over to their website. So first, their origin. Where did Creation Ministries International come from? Who are they? They are actually an offshoot of Answers in Genesis. So they came over from Australia with Answers in Genesis and then split. There was a falling out. There's a long history. There are documents you can pull up online of kind of the timeline for how this happened. It's kind of a whole lot of drama, but basically there was a falling out about the leadership at Answers in Genesis. And so Creation Ministries International split from AIG in the year 2006. So that's kind of where they come from. It's kind of, that does say some things about where they're at today and why kind of CMI and Answers in Genesis don't collaborate a ton. They don't do much together. They're kind of off doing their own thing. What kind of resources do they offer? Well, CMI has a newsletter. You can do their daily newsletter. They'll send something to you every single day, or you can do a more split up newsletter where you don't get something daily. That's kind of a little too extreme and fills up your inbox too quickly. They have a normal newsletter. They have lots and lots of articles on their website. They have a free daily article that comes up every day, and that's the thing that gets emailed to you if you take their daily newsletter. They have a YouTube channel, and their YouTube channel is pretty good. If you hop onto their YouTube channel, they have they have good interviewers who just kind of sit across from a creationist, and then they ask questions, and the creationist kind of answers the questions, and I've seen some of those. So they have a pretty good YouTube channel. They, of course, have podcasts, lots and lots of different videos. They have a magazine, and you can subscribe to their magazine. They used to send physical copies, and now it's just an online magazine, unfortunately. But that is something that you can get. And then another cool thing that they can do, and I've wanted to do this with CMI here in New England. I want to bring a speaker up here. What you can do is you can book a speaker that comes to your church, and they will take care of that for free. They take care of the cost of that. They want to reach your church, and so if you have a facility for them, you have somewhere to host, they will send a speaker out to you. Do they have an academic journal? Yes, they have an academic journal. It's called Journal of Creation. Again, I've already said my piece on the academic journals from these big organizations. I don't really know much about the peer review of CMI, full disclosure. Maybe it's great. I have just subscribed to the Journal of Creation, so I'm just going to start to get their more academic articles and see kind of the things that they have to say. So they do have an academic journal, and kind of just take that for what it is. Names to know. Who are the people at CMI that you should keep an eye on? And this is going to be, I'm not going to pretend that I'm giving you the objective best names in the organization to look out for. I'm just going to give you names that I think are particularly important with the organization, or maybe names that I know of and can recommend you keep an eye out for. Now, this full disclosure, I have interacted a lot less with CMI than I have with the other two big organizations. That said, I have had the pleasure of meeting Robert Carter a couple of times. I've seen some of his research that he's presented. He's a great kind of representative of CMI. So I highly recommend keeping up with Rob Carter's material. any pros and cons that I give with Creation Organizations, take that and put that in one corner of your mind. Yes, I have some problems with the big three creation organizations. Put that in one corner of your mind, but in the other corner of your mind, completely separate from that, I highly recommend Robert Carter's work. I think he's a great representative of creation science. And he has done things outside of CMI as well. He was in the Is Genesis History movie, which I'm a huge fan of and recommend a lot. And I've summarized his research in blog articles before. So if you go over to New Creation blog and you go over to some of the articles that I've read or that I've written, I've done stuff based on Rob Carter's materials before. Can't recommend Robert Carter enough. Another guy I actually have not met personally before, but he's a big influence on the channel on CMI. He is Jonathan Sarfati. I have a hard time with his last name, but he's another one to keep an eye out for. He's done a lot of work with CMI as well. Okay, so what is kind of a highlight of their research? What scientific research have they done that I would recommend? I would, like I say, check out Rob Carter's work in population genetics, his mutation rates, his research. I would say it's kind of a highlight from my personal standpoint. But again, I just subscribed to CMI. I just kind of paid to get their Journal of Creation articles. So I'm very new to CMI. I'm not going to know as much about them as I will about the other two organizations. So take what I say about them with a grain of salt, but I will recommend Rob Carter's work for sure. All right, what does their website look like? Let's take a look. Here is the website for it's creation.com, right? I don't know how they got a hold of this, but creation.com is theirs. Let's scroll down here a bit. This is what their website looks like. They have lots of articles kind of up at the top. And then they always have these events going on. Here is what the Journal of Creation looks like. You can get Creation magazine. It is unfortunately all online. I wish they still published physical copies, but they don't do that anymore. Okay, so you can navigate to key topics that they discuss. If you click on that, they have all sorts of topics you can read about. You can read about aliens. Look at that. Then they have apologetics. Like I said, creation organizations tend to be apologetic focused. You can read about the Bible, creation relevance, dating methods, biology. All of these topics are there. So a great resource to go to read up on all of these things. It looks pretty good. So let's hop over to media. There's their podcast, Creation Talk Podcast, different events that are there. And then you can, of course, request an event, get a speaker to come to you. And then where is there's Journal of Creation. Who we are. Here we go. Let's go here. So here are the people involved. So the CEO is a man named Aaron Hughes. And then there's Jonathan's, I'm not even going to try and say his last name again. He has a PhD in physical chemistry. And so I've seen him on the YouTube channel, podcast before. He's pretty good. Dr. Robert Carter is, again, the guy I keep recommending. He has a PhD in marine biology, but does a lot of great work in genetics and modeling genetics and things like that. He's a speaker, writer, researcher. He kind of does it all for CMI. Scott Gillis is over at CMI. He's kind of one of their speakers. A lot of what they do is speaking. They have people that you can, again, book a speaker. They'll send somebody out, and they will be your speaker. Joel Tay is kind of a well-known, kind of recognizable face over there. You'll see him on the YouTube channel a lot. And so, yeah, so these are kind of the people behind CMI. And I don't really know a lot about the rest of these people, but there's their Canada office. They have a Canada office, and I think they have an Australia, and there's a New Zealand office, and they have an Australia office as well, because they came over from Australia. Okay. Let's go back here. Let's talk about the second organization, Institute for Creation Research. So what is ICR? Well, they are not associated with other organizations. Their origin is completely independent. They come from a college called the Christian Heritage College that kind of grew, and then they have this research division, I guess, of this school. And that became the Institute for Creation Research. So an independent origin for ICR. They are not attached to other organizations like CMI is. Um, and they are a pretty good organization. I like a lot of what ICR does. They have articles. They have a magazine called Acts and Facts that they do publish and print off as a physical copy, and it is totally free. So go and subscribe to Acts and Facts. One of the things I've thought to do with my YouTube channel is to kind of review Acts and Facts magazine. So if you kind of subscribe to them for free, they send you a magazine, and then I can kind of talk about those articles that have come out. They have a podcast. They have DVDs that you can purchase and watch. They have mailing materials. They have their own museum down in Texas, the ICR Creation Museum. They have what they do not have, though, is an academic journal. They do not have an academic journal. What they do have is a tab on their website that is the academic articles section that they consider to be more scientifically academic articles as opposed to their more general articles for lay people. All right, names to know and be aware of. Definitely Randy Galuza. He's kind of the head of ICR. He's done good research with them, and he's kind of been the face of the organization for a little bit. Tim Clary is a big name to know, done a ton of research for ICR. Brian Thomas is very well known, and Jeffrey Tompkins. So all of these guys I'm much more familiar with than I am for most of the ICR, for the CMI people. I basically know Rob Carter from CMI, and then from ICR I know most of these people and familiar with a lot of their works. So Jeffrey Tompkins has been kind of in the headlines recently, if you follow creationism closely, for doing some research on whether or not chimpanzees and humans are 99% similar. And I actually come out on a different side as Jeffrey Tompkins does on that issue. I think humans and chimpanzees are 99% similar, and that's a video for another day. But basically, so all that to say, some of these people I don't actually end up on the same side as these scientists do. But and Brian Thomas has done some work on kind of everything. He's all over the place, but he's done stuff on dinosaurs. He's done stuff on human evolution and kind of debunking human evolution. And I disagree with a lot of the stuff that they kind of put out. But they're doing scientific research and they're coming up with these things, and so we can have a conversation about that. Tim Clary and Randy Galuza as well. Now, one thing I will say, I do love the research that Randy Galuza has done with his cavefish research, and it's not just him; it's kind of everybody over at ICR. There's several people who have come together and put together a research project on cavefish, and they've developed this new model called continuous environmental tracking, or CET for short. And so continuous environmental tracking is basically this idea that organisms adapt internally to their environments instead of natural selection working on the organisms. They internally respond and adapt to conditions that change outside of them. So it's not a selection process that is top down. It is more a bottom up engineered perspective that organisms are engineered to adapt and change their environments. So this kind of helps us with explaining quick adaptations, rapid evolution, the things that I've been talking about a lot in my research. Their model kind of helps shed light and explain that. So big fan of their CET model and of the research they're doing. I'm not sure we're at the point now where we can remove natural selection entirely. In fact, I still think natural selection is a pretty steadfast and consistent mechanism for evolutionary change. So I would disagree to an extent. I do think natural selection exists and is a real process, but that's not to say that CET is not a good model for mapping out species changing. And so that's something that I think is worth studying. And I think it's worth the research that they did. So it's kind of, I kind of fall on that as a both and. I think natural selection is still a thing, but I think CET is on the right track as well for explaining how we get so many different species in such a short period of time. So I like that model. That's the kind of research I would recommend. All right, let's check out ICR's website. So one thing about Institute for Creation Research you have to remember is that they are, they're all scientists. And so their website doesn't quite look as good or flashy or kind of visually appealing as maybe CMI or Answers in Genesis or any other kind of education website. because they're scientists and they're just putting out these articles. Now, that's not to say they don't get involved in apologetics or other types of other topics. Look, they have a Thanksgiving article out, which we have a Thanksgiving article coming out with the new Creation blog. So they have testimony to design. A lot of their stuff is identifying design in organisms, which is really cool. And they have a lot of engineers, so they kind of bring an engineering focus and interpret. They bring an engineering perspective to nature, and so they're constantly finding evidence of engineering in these organisms, and they're explaining it by looking at the organism internally instead of saying that they are adapting or evolving or that there are external circumstances or conditions that are driving these organisms towards developing these traits. So we have dinosaur blood vessels. They write a lot about that. Brian Thomas is very active in that, talking about how we're finding biological material in dinosaurs that should have long ago decayed away. And then there's some articles for kids as well. They have videos on the side, get to know Randy Galuza, biblical archaeology, things like that. So they get into different types of things. And so you go to their publications, there's their Acts and Facts, completely free resource. You can read them online or you can order them and get them delivered to you as magazines. They have devotionals. They have they have topics like the Bible, created kinds. They have technical papers. So there's your not academic journal, but a technical papers section. And then subscriptions to things you can subscribe to, and then article submissions. Then over other resources over at media, you have different podcasts. The Creation podcast is pretty popular. You can go to their social media sites, DVD series, and then they have events. Their speakers do travel and speak. I actually got to see one of my first experiences with ICR is I got to drive up to New Hampshire and see Randy Galuza and Brian Thomas speak at an event up there. So they do have a ministry where their creation speakers go to different places and give talks. And so that's pretty cool. So again, I like a lot of ICR stuff. Again, they fall into some of the traps that I talk about that the big three organizations fall into. And one thing I will say is ICR did have a history of attacking or calling out other creationists and name calling. There was an instance where in an Acts and Facts article, they attacked certain creationists. And then later on, they actually published an article apologizing for it right before the big creation organization called the the International Conference on Creation. So they did kind of have that happen, but they apologized for it. And to their credit, they have kind of moved away from that. And now Randy Galuza has in particular reached out and done some events with the creationists who were name called by ICR as kind of a way of kind of bridging that gap and saying, we don't want to be known as an organization that attacks other creationists. So here they are. Here they're speakers. Randy Galuza is a speaker. He has a PhD, has an engineering background. Tim Clary does a lot of work in geology and dinosaurs. Again, I'll actually fall on different positions than Tim Clary does on a lot of research, and Randy Galuza and kind of all of these scientists. But I do recommend you checking out their work and seeing their different approaches to the issues in creationism. So Tim Clary in particular, I would say I disagree with him on the flood boundary issue in particular. He would hold to a high Cenozoic flood boundary, and he makes sense of it. He makes good arguments from it from the standpoint of geology on why the flood boundary is there. But just from a perspective of the fossil record and biostratigraphy, as someone who kind of looks at things from that mindset, because I'm always looking at the organisms, the animals, I'm a zoology background. From a zoology perspective, a lower Cenozoic flood boundary makes a lot more sense to me. So that's not to say that I don't recommend his work or I don't think he's a good scientist. It's just something that we disagree on because I can see a lot of evidence in the fossil record for it being one way, and he sees evidence in geology for it being a different way. And then there are other research scientists here. I know a little bit less about these guys. I don't know a ton about Frank Sherwin. I just kind of know the name, even though his background is zoology. So I should probably find out more about him. I did get to see Jake Hebert. I have gotten to see him give a talk at Creation Research Society this past year, so I'm a little bit more familiar with him. He has this interesting idea about animal longevity and how animals used to live longer than they do. But it doesn't quite work if you take my perspective on the flood boundary. But of course, he would agree with Tim Clary's view on the flood boundary. So in Tim Clary's model, it would make a lot of sense. It would be interesting research, but I don't think they have the flood boundary right, and so his research there kind of doesn't work, in my opinion. But he does do a lot of work exposing problems with the Big Bang Theory, so you can check that out as an apologetics resource. Dr. Brian Thomas, I have a personal story about Dr. Brian Thomas, which is that I had the most awkward interaction with him probably of all time. And if he ever watches this, he'll probably laugh and remember this, because I came up to him up in New Hampshire and wanted to meet him. And I didn't really, it's probably partially my fault, but I kind of went up to him and I didn't really have any questions in mind. I literally just wanted to meet him. And so I like introduced myself and I shook his hand and I gave him a card about the New Creation blog, which he had heard of. So I kind of assumed he would know who the New Creation blog is. And then that was kind of it. And he just kind of stood there and I kind of stood there. And my dad was there with me. I actually had told him about the conference. He hadn't really gotten to see, he hadn't been in front row in anything creation science before, but he knew how involved I was with it. So I got him to come up to New Hampshire for it. And so we all just kind of stood there and looked at each other, and it was kind of brutal. Unfortunately, you would think that maybe I don't know, professional creationists would just start talking about something, and oftentimes they do. I think that's why I didn't come up to him with any questions in mind already, because when you talk to these creation scientists, so often they stuff just kind of flows out of them, things they want to talk about, things they're passionate about. And Dr. Brian Thomas, he just doesn't have that, I guess, personality. He doesn't walk around trying to convey his knowledge or like spread his knowledge to everybody. He's kind of a more reserved individual, I guess. And so I was like, hi, my name's Jake Ramgren and I'm with the New Creation blog, and like, thanks for coming out, and I finally get to meet you and stuff. And it's just like this, cool. Like, he wasn't mean or anything. It wasn't rude. It was just kind of awkward, and he's not that kind of scientist. Whereas if I go up to somebody else, and I went up to Randy Galuza at the same time, and I did have questions for Randy Galuza, so that helped. But Randy Galuza, once I probe a little bit, and he's just, and he'll tell you all sorts of things. And so a little bit less awkward for that. But for Randy Galuza, I think Randy Galuza is such a great guy. I've loved listening to his research. I've listened to him talk in person several times now in different places, and just cannot recommend his material enough. Again, can't say that I kind of agree with his take on everything. I think he has an engineering perspective, and I think I have a zoology perspective. And so we're going to kind of not agree on some things. Again, I think natural selection is a pretty observable process, and he will disagree with that. And he thinks that what we're seeing when we look at what we think we're seeing when we observe natural selection is not actually what we're observing. What we're actually observing is organisms internally adapting. And while I think that there is internal engineered adaptation in organisms, I do think natural selection still plays a part, and I'd prefer to look at things as a combination of internal adaptation and external forces acting on organisms. And he doesn't want to say anything about selection or external circumstances. He wants to remove that entirely and just look at the organism itself, which is what an engineer would do when you look at organisms. That's totally fine. But as a zoologist, I guess was trained this way. I was just trained to look at both the organism and the circumstances around the organism. And I think that's the right approach to go to still. I still think you should look at both. But Randy Galuza is great. His research is really, really good to listen to. And even zoologists like myself and other biologists and other scientists definitely learn a lot from Galuza's work. So definitely recommend Randy Galuza. A lot of these other guys are good scientists. I do disagree with them on quite a bit. And then we get to Jeffrey Tompkins, who's been kind of making his rounds more recently on YouTube. He got very, very criticized heavily by a lot of non-creationists, and it's all on the topic of whether or not humans and chimpanzees share 99% of our DNA. And I think it's okay to say, yes, we are 99% similar. Jeffrey Tompkins, what he did was he used a different methodology to find out that humans and chimpanzees were less than 99%, and it was more in the 80s in terms of percent similarity. And he tried to use that methodology. The problem was his method. If you use his methodology in total, then organisms that are very, very related end up coming up a lot less related. And so I could dive into that and talk more about that, but that's not what the purpose of this video is. I'm just saying I think Jeffrey Tompkins used an incorrect approach to showing that humans and chimpanzees are not 99% related. And, that's just kind of, it is what it is. It's just an observation. That's just what I think happened there is he's using a method. He's trying to come up with a result that humans and chimpanzees are not related. And he used a methodology that you can use, but if you do use it, then like, for example, gorillas and other gorillas that should be, they should be 99% related because they're all gorillas, but they end up being in the 80s because you used this methodology. And I would say that's not the correct methodology to use. So I do have critiques of the scientists. I have things I disagree with and issues that come up on the other side of. But would I recommend using ICR? I definitely would. They'll give you a good rundown on different issues in creation and evolution. You can, and maybe they're right on a lot of these things. And so you read their stuff and you can learn a lot about creation and evolution. But that's just to show you, I guess, that I wouldn't recommend going to ICR and going to Answers in Genesis and going to CMI and reading their articles and just taking their word for it. I wouldn't just take their word as true all the time. And they would say don't do that either because they're different organizations and they're going to say different things. So I'm just trying to be fair here as we keep going in this journey of creation organizations. So with that, we get to and here is a picture that I took of Randy Galuza up in New Hampshire when I went and saw him giving his talk there. And so their biological theory of design says that organisms change internally. They have adaptive tracking is what it's called. They're always tracking their environment. And when their environment changes, they immediately adapt to it. No natural selection required. I would agree with the first two parts and then disagree with the no natural selection required. I do think natural selection is a significant and observable force occurring in nature. All right, so I was a little premature there, but now we get to the big one, Answers in Genesis. So where did Answers in Genesis come from? Well, comes from Ken Ham and his ministry that he started in Australia. They have many different resources, including articles, videos. They have a TV channel, Answers TV, that you can subscribe to and get all sorts of TV content. They have Answers Magazine. They have the museum and the Ark Encounter that you can go to. They have a ton of things that you can use. They have VBS I didn't even put the VBS programs there. They're associated with what is the textbooks, the museum, the curriculum that they have. Bob Jones University. I apologize. Bob Jones University is associated with Answers in Genesis, and so that's they just have so many resources that they have at their disposal. Do they have an academic journal? Yes, they have Answers Research Journal. Is it very academic? Sometimes not. I just got to be honest. I think their peer review needs a little bit of work. If you go on to Answers Research Journal and you read some articles, some of it is just not extremely academic. It's not quite up to snuff, unfortunately. But there is some good stuff on there, but just a lot of it, take it with a grain of salt. Take it as individual articles. So look at an article and read the abstract and try and figure out if this is really academic. And if you read scientific papers a lot, you'll be able to recognize when a paper is not really doing that. So unfortunately, Answers Research Journal, I think some of their stuff is not quite there. It's not quite reliable, but they do have it there to access. And a lot of the older stuff is pretty good. Andrew Snelling used to be the kind of head of the Answers Research Journal, and I'm a big fan of Andrew Snelling. So, it used to be a lot better. And I think kind of more recently, especially since he's retired, Andrew Snelling has retired, there's been a lot of kind of decrease in quality among Answers Research Journal articles. Names to know. Well, definitely Ken Ham. Obviously, Ken Ham is the Answers in Genesis guy. As I talked about, one of the cons with organizations is that they can kind of centralize their power around one person. Answers in Genesis has definitely done that with Ken Ham. This is Ken Ham's everything. Everything in Answers in Genesis comes back to Ken Ham. He, on their website, which we'll go to in a second, on their website, everything is Ken Ham. The articles that come up first are Ken Ham's blog. He doesn't even write all the articles in his blog. He has a team that writes the articles for him, but they're cited to be Ken Ham because it's all him. Andrew Snelling is a good name to know. Unfortunately, he has been retired for a little bit of time now. I did get to meet him a couple of times before he retired, which is awesome. He's a really, really smart guy. And his fingerprints are still all over the research in Answers in Genesis, and he still publishes articles from them every now and then. He just did kind of recently. So Andrew Snelling is a good name to know. Danny Faulkner is a good name to know. He does a lot of astronomy and cosmology work. Their critiques of the Big Bang Theory. He's trying to develop a new creation cosmology model. So things like that. So these are some of the good things to know. What is a research highlight? I'm going to kind of cheat with the research highlight. Andrew Snelling's Grand Canyon research is going to be definitely the highlight, where he went into the Grand Canyon and he got samples. He did this with John Whitmore, and this is all in the film Is Genesis History? Mountains After the Flood. They got samples of the rock, and they demonstrated pretty empirically that the rock layers that folded in the Grand Canyon were actually very wet, and that's why they were moist, and that's why they folded under tectonic activity. So they kind of showed that it was flood related, whereas the conventional model has it being volcanic related. And so they demonstrated that pretty well. So great research there from Andrew Snelling. I say it's kind of cheating because Answers in Genesis did not put out that research. That was Is Genesis History that put out that research, and Answers in Genesis actually isn't a huge fan of Is Genesis History, and so they didn't actually promote that material whatsoever, which is too bad because it was great research. But Answers in Genesis, again, they fall prey to some of the cons of being a creation organization, and they don't love Is Genesis History. They prefer to promote their own material. But because Andrew Snelling is part of Answers in Genesis and he did that research, I'm using that as a research highlight for Answers in Genesis, even though they weren't explicitly part of that research. So again, we can't talk about Answers in Genesis without focusing on Ken Ham. He has taken Answers in Genesis in a new direction, and they very obviously so. What the direction they have taken is very apologetics and ministry focused. They've gotten involved in the culture war, and they do a lot of things that are very, conservative, right wing culture war stuff. And so that's kind of the thing that Answers in Genesis has been doing more recently. They've also been known to be the most critical of other creationists. They like their approach. And if you don't follow their approach and you go off and do something else and you call it young earth creationism, you are subject to being attacked by Answers in Genesis. And that's just the fact of the matter as it is now, unfortunately. So I would say, again, there's some questions in their peer review. I don't think their peer review process is quite up to snuff. I don't think their academic journal is at the same level as other academic journals. A lot of it, though, to their credit, I do like this about them, is a lot of it is response articles. And so a lot of it is someone will publish an article, and then they will publish another person responding to that article, and then they will let the first person respond to their response. And so you kind of get a dialogue going. And I think that's pretty cool to do in Answers Research Journal. And very often I will find myself, I will get caught reading articles and then response to those articles and response to that article. And then eventually I see kind of who's right in the back and forth, and it's helped me kind of navigate that topic. And I will say, oh, this person's actually right here. I see what they're saying. And it's even gotten to the point where I'm pulling my hair out at the person who's wrong, and I'm like, you're just wrong. Like, you're not defending your position very well. It's just bad publishing. So I respect Answers in Genesis for publishing those response articles and letting people go back and forth. One thing I will say, though, is Answers in Genesis has their own scientists, and very often the person that I'm pulling my hair out saying, no, you're wrong, is the Answers in Genesis scientist. So it's kind of funny. They publish these articles and they go back and forth, and then I read them and I can see the logic of both sides, which is to their credit because they're publishing these things. You see both sides. The other thing, though, is that the person that I disagree with and I say, you're not doing good science, your research is bad, and I'm pulling my hair out that you don't see this, those tend to be the Answers in Genesis scientists as opposed to scientists from other groups that are publishing in the Answers Research Journal. So it's kind of a pros and cons. And then on the one thing to note on the issues, I didn't do this for the other organizations, but I just thought I would note Answers in Genesis does not agree with feathered dinosaurs, and they also put the upper Cenozoic flood boundary that ICR does. That again, I just don't see it. I don't see how the flood boundary can be the upper Cenozoic, and I also have no problem with believing in feathered dinosaurs. So some issues that I disagree with Answers in Genesis on, that they are taking a very firm stance in. So if it sounds like I hope it doesn't sound like I'm attacking Answers in Genesis here. I'm just kind of I'm helping you navigate Answers on Genesis, see where they're at on the issues, and see what resources are available to you. And then I'm just giving you my perspective on whether or not there are good resources and what is good and what is not so good with the Answers in Genesis source. So that's just how it is. And Answers in Genesis does as well have a history of attacking other creationists, kind of like ICR did, and they have not yet apologized or walked that back yet. And basically, their attack is exactly the same that ICR did, very much like word for word. I think you can go to Joel Duff's channel. He's a theistic evolutionist, and he has walked through all of these internal fighting among creationists. And he has said, yeah, ICR put out this article, and then Answers in Genesis put out these articles, and they're like the same exact line of reasoning, the same exact attacks, the same exact arguments against other creationists. ICR has since apologized for that and said, we're sorry we name called. We don't want to do that. We want to, disagree in Christ-like love. And Answers in Genesis has not yet done that. Those articles are still up on their website. They're still there. Okay. And then the other thing is really, so I said that the research highlight is Andrew Snelling's research. And then I said that research is not exactly associated with Answers in Genesis, other than the fact that Andrew Snelling is part of Answers in Genesis, or he was before he retired. And then he still publishes articles for them now and then. So what must be asked is, what research are they actually doing in there that is not Andrew Snelling's research, which is not technically a part of them? What research are they doing? And the answer is not that much. In fact, I had a hard time finding research information on their website. And so one thing that they do have at Answers in Genesis is a chatbot. They have Answers AI. They have their own AI platform. And a very entertaining video is one of my colleagues, Peter Brummel, who's a writer over at New Creation blog. He made a video where he got Answers AI to argue with, I think it was ChatGPT or Grok or one of those AIs, and he got them to argue about creation and evolution, which is pretty funny. So, but I went over to the chatbot and I asked them, what is a current research project Answers in Genesis is working on? And the chatbot came back and said, we are currently working on several exciting research projects that confirm the truth of God's word. For example, Dr. Gabriella Haynes, our PhD paleontologist, is researching soft tissue and blood cells found in fossils, which challenges the idea that these fossils are millions of years old and supports the biblical timeline. And then Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, our Harvard-trained PhD scientist, is conducting genetics research that demonstrates how human populations confirm the biblical account of history beginning about 6,000 years ago, including evidence that all humans descend from Noah's sons after the flood. So they have a couple of research projects, I guess, ongoing, but then they put a link there for me to read more. And when I clicked on that link, I got what is happening in AIG's research department. And this article is from 2019. That's 6 years ago. They had an article about what research is happening. And then I also noticed that Nathaniel Jeanson and Gabriella Haynes are both very active right now, but Gabriella Haynes publishes on the Answers Research Journal, and she argues with other creationists a lot about feathered dinosaurs and other things like that. And so I don't see a ton of new research being put out by Answers in Genesis, even on their own research journal. The other thing that I saw is Nathaniel Jeanson did have a project, or quote unquote research project recently, and it was talking about why 99% of PhD scientists reject creation, which is not a very scientific question. And it was really, I have to say, it was not very convincing to me. Not that it wasn't convincing, but that it wasn't an interesting question in the first place. His proposal is that he gathered together all the schools that teach science all together, and he looked at all the creation science colleges that teach creation, and found out that like 99% of scientists are trained in evolution and 1% of scientists are exposed to creation. And that's why 99% of PhDs are evolutionists and 1% of PhDs are creationists. And I just don't find that to be that compelling of a result. It's kind of, he's saying there's a correlation there that you believe in evolution only because you're taught evolution. And my thinking is, well, does that mean the 1% of people who believe creation are only believe that because they were taught creation? Like, I don't see what new information that gives us in terms of whether or not creation is true or whether or not evolution is true. It has nothing to do, the whole prompt that he researched has nothing to do with whether or not creation is true, whether or not evolution is true. It's literally just correlating what you're taught to what you believe, which everybody knows is a correlation there. Everybody knows that if you believe in a flat earth, someone at some time probably taught you that there's a flat earth. Like you could do the same thing and say 100% of PhDs believe the earth is round because they were never exposed to the idea of there being a flat earth. You can do the same thing with literally any other topic and just correlate what people are taught with what they believe. There's always a correlation there. It's people do this all the time, and it's only interesting if there isn't a correlation. It's, for example, if like 60% of Christians are brought up in a Christian household and are taught Christianity, and then only 40% of adults believe in Christianity, that means people are leaving Christianity. And so that's an interesting result. But saying that what people are taught is the same as what they believe, that's not new. Like that's not interesting. And so the fact that I asked Answers in Genesis, what research are you coming up with? And the chatbot gave me 2 scientists. Both scientists aren't really doing that much new scientific research currently that's being put out. And then the article that they gave me is from 2019. That's 6 years ago. I don't see a lot of groundbreaking research happening in Answers in Genesis as opposed to like ICR and their cavefish research. So maybe I'm speaking too soon. Maybe someone will correct me and come in and say, hey, this is a research project Answers in Genesis is doing. But I'm confident in saying this only because I'm also in creationist circles. And I talk to people who are PhD creationists. And they are pointing out that Answers in Genesis is taking their organization in a direction that is not research focused. And they're taking their organization in a direction that is very culture war, battle, conservative values, winning the culture, those kind of directions. And so, yeah, they still have Answers Research Journal and they still have people publishing works there. But what it tends to be is Gabriella Haynes arguing about creation issues within creation circles and saying, no, we can't say dinosaurs had feathers or whatever it is. And then Nathaniel Jeanson, I don't think he's published this in Answers Research Journal yet. And this seems to be only something that they're reserving for the Answers in Genesis website, which is probably where it should go because, again, it's not that interesting of a study. I don't see 99% of PhD scientists being evolutionists as that interesting of a thing to research or to correlate with what people are taught. So again, if you can't tell, I'm not as high on Answers in Genesis as I am with ICR or CMI. And I really think that the future of creationism can definitely be outside of Answers in Genesis. And that's kind of why I'm doing a lot of what I'm doing. I'm building a platform in Creation Reformation. I'm part of a platform in the New Creation blog and the New Creation movement. That's kind of where I am. And I think that's the direction that creationism can go, while Answers in Genesis goes in the direction of culture war battles and, Ken Ham's blog articles. That's kind of where Answers in Genesis is at right now. And a lot of creationists are on the outside looking in with Answers in Genesis, wondering where they're going and why they're doing what they're doing. Why haven't they apologized for attacking other creationists and name calling other creationists? And then why are they so exclusively doing this culture war approach and then calling out anyone who disagrees with them? Why don't they have a successor to Ken Ham? Why is it just Ken Ham? Why isn't their research branch doing that much? They're sending their resources more towards having a full-time worship band at the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. So Answers in Genesis is kind of in a weird place right now, and there's some good material on there you can find, and you can find articles that explain things pretty well. And I would also say that among the creation organizations, Answers in Genesis is the one that misunderstands evolution the most. So if I go to their website, here is Answers in Genesis, and if I go to, again, it's Ken Ham's blog. We have an article about transgenderism from Lita Sanders. So not Ken Ham, but a culture war article on transgenderism. Then you have another transgenderism part from Ken Ham's blog. You have a video from Ken Ham on the right. Another Ken Ham thing down here. So it's a whole lot of Ken Ham, and it's all, again, culture war stuff. And then Andrew Snelling did get an article about the Labrie tar pits. So there's a science article. And again, I'd recommend reading that. I do think Andrew Snelling's a pretty smart guy and has good stuff. So there's some good stuff on here. But then let's also go over to their answers tab. If I go to their answers tab, we get a ton of different topics here. Age of the Earth, animals, Bible. Again, kudos to the people who built this website because they have a very good brand going for them. They have really good pictures, very good organization. It's easy to find stuff. But here's an example of where they kind of misrepresent evolution. So if I go over to evolution, let me go here. Macro versus micro defined. Okay, here's something that creationists get wrong all the time. And it's probably not just Answers in Genesis here. But here's what they say. Macroevolution is used to describe large-scale changes believed to be able to turn a blob of protoplasm into a person. Okay, that is a little misrepresentative. Macroevolution is not necessarily turning a blob of protoplasm into a person. Macroevolution is any significant change that is at or above the species level. So if a blob of protoplasm, which isn't even a cell, okay? Evolution actually is never intended to turn a cell from a non-cell, okay? So they're not even talking about evolution here. Getting a blob of protoplasm, let's say getting life from non-life is not evolution. That's something called abiogenesis. It's a completely different field of research. And an evolutionist is not interested in how life arose. An evolutionist is interested in how that life changed into a different type of life. So macroevolution is intended to explain how we get one cell to how we get a new species of cell to how then that species became a different species of cell. And then, it's all about how these things branch off and create new things. So any change at a species level that gets you a new species, that is macroevolution, according to evolutionists who get to define their terms. But then creationists come in and they say, no, let's say macroevolution is protoplasm to person, right? Goo to you via the zoo is what they like to say. That's not what macroevolution actually is. So this is a misrepresentation here. Macroevolution is used to describe the large-scale changes believed to be able to turn a blob of protoplasm into a person. That's not even correct. By contrast, microevolution is intended to describe the small-scale changes within populations. Okay, that's a pretty good definition, actually. We're describing small-scale changes within populations, such as those exhibited by Darwin's finches. The finch populations change beak size regularly in response to environmental pressures. However, they remain finches. No new major traits take place. So that sentence isn't too bad. Microevolution is within populations. But let's scroll down here. Since the term evolution is so strongly associated with the particles to people myth, we tend to use the word speciation to explain adaptation and variation within the created kinds, such as that exhibited by the finches. Okay, that's fine. You can say that, but they have to recognize that to an evolutionist, speciation equals macroevolution. Microevolution, they use that in their definition of microevolution. So microevolution is small-scale changes within populations of the same species. Okay, so a wolf, Darwin talked about like a wolf population that develops stealth to hunt cattle and sheep versus wolves that are bulkier and more muscular to chase down deer in the mountains. That's microevolution. They're developing different changes within populations. And then as soon as you get a new species, that takes changes that are macroevolutionary, according to the way they use it in evolutionary literature. So when then they come down here and say, because evolution is so strongly associated with particles to people myth, we use the word speciation to explain adaptation and variation. But a normal evolutionist looks at speciation, and that is evolutionary change. That is macroevolutionary change. Because they go on to say, because the small-scale changes generally lead to a loss of genetic information rather than a gain of new information needed to create new traits like arms and eyes, microevolution can never lead to macroevolution. But that's ridiculous. Microevolution, of course, leads to macroevolution. I can give you one good example. We believe, Answers in Genesis believes that a fox and a wolf belong to the same ancestor. Well, a fox has so many completely different traits from a wolf, right? They have the bushier tail, the smaller size. Let's even look at a fennec fox from the desert that has big ears and it's much smaller and is a different color. To get to a fennec fox versus, say, a gray wolf, those are macroevolutionary changes. The fox even has a different number of chromosomes than the wolf does. So these are dramatic changes that get to two things. And so I think Institute for Creation Research gets this a little bit more right, even though they don't like saying the word macroevolution for good reason. they still admit that we need dramatic changes happening to get a fennec fox and a gray wolf from the same ancestor. You need dramatic change happening in a short period of time. That is macroevolution. That's about as macro as it gets, is dramatic, quick, significant, big changes, chromosome changes, and morphological changes in such a short amount of time. That is what everyone will consider macroevolution. So it's one thing to say you don't like saying macroevolution because the term is confusing. It's another thing to say we can't say macroevolution because macroevolution means molecule to man evolution. That's not what macroevolution means at all. Evolutionists tend to use these ideas interchangeably. For this reason, we avoid using macroevolution and macroevolution, preferring to speak of speciation within created kinds and molecules to man evolution, which is unobservable and unverifiable. So they're trying to simplify this for the layperson, but by simplifying it, they're misrepresenting it. Unfortunately, they have to understand that macroevolutionary changes are something that creationists need to have. And so they're trying to kind of have their cake and eat it too by saying macroevolutionary changes do happen, but we don't want to call that macroevolution because it's happening within a created kind. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. But I think this isn't getting the theory of evolution right. And I also think one thing I will disagree with them in is that all changes lead to a loss of genetic information rather than a gain of new information. Gains of new information happen all the time in nature. And so there's another kind of misrepresentation there. What they're referring to is like that a fox and a domestic dog, for example, have, I guess, less genetic information or less genetic potential than the created dog kind that got off the ark. And so that's fair to say, but to say that all genetic changes are going downwards, I think is actually incorrect. Okay, so that's kind of my take. I'm going to wrap it up here because I've been going on for a while. But there's your kind of guide to the big three organizations. Take everything you hear as just kind of my perspective on the three organizations. I do think that there's actually some problems you got to look out for with these organizations. But overall, again, most of the people that I've actually talked about with these organizations, I'm a huge fan of. I can recommend their work. I like guys at ICR. I like the guys at CMI. I like a couple of the people at Answers in Genesis, even though I'm very critical of Answers in Genesis. I like a lot of the people over there. I'm a fan of Danny Faulkner, and I still got to meet Danny Faulkner. I keep going to conferences that he should be at, and he didn't make it to Creation Research Society this year. So I got to get around to meeting him. But I like Danny Faulkner's work. I think he has some really great papers in Creation Research Society, and he's a critic of other creationists who work for these other organizations, and sometimes rightfully so. So I like Danny Faulkner. I like Andrew Snelling. I like Rob Carter over at CMI. I love Randy Galuza's work over at ICR. He's a great person to talk to, brilliant mind. So there's a lot of great people out there in these creation organizations. I do think it's not beneficial to walk through these three organizations and pretend that everything is something that we should recommend and everything is great science and that these scientists are just as good as the evolutionary scientists and that they are, disproving them left and right, and that the secular scientists don't have anything on the creation scientists, right? I don't think that's necessarily true. So I can recommend some of their research and some of the people behind these organizations, but these organizations themselves, they have some problems they got to work through. Some of it is just the result of being a big organization, and some of it is things that they need to do better about, particularly Answers in Genesis, that they have to do better in the way they represent the other side and the way they represent evolutionary ideas. And this is not the last time I'm going to kind of critique creation discourse. I have a whole series coming up planned where I just talk about creation discourse and what it's like in creation circles and kind of the best way to disagree on issues in creationism. But that's a time for another day. This kind of wraps up my video here. Hopefully this helps you navigate Answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research, and the Creation Ministries International. But those are who they are, kind of the origin of those organizations, and how to navigate the three. So thanks for spending some time with me today. This is Jake Ramgren with the Creation Reformation YouTube channel. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.